Why does a bottle of water cost $20 at a grocery store but 200 at an airport? Same water, same bottle, but completely different price? Or think about this, why did eggs suddenly get crazy expensive in 2022? Why do some countries stay poor even though they have all the natural resources? Why does printing more money cause prices to rise? And why does the government sometimes just give people free money? Well, these aren't random events. There are forces, invisible but very real, that shapes every single one of them. And once you understand these forces, you will never look at the world the same way again. And honestly, that's what economics is. Not boring graphs and textbook definitions. Economics is the story of how humans make decisions, how societies work, and why the world is the way it is. And today, in about 18 minutes, I'm going to give you the foundation that most people never get, even people who study it in school. So let's get started. Part 1. So what even is economics? Here's the simple definition I know. Economics is the study of how people make choices when they can't have everything. Because here's the brutal truth about life. Resources are limited. Time, money, land, oil, food, there's only so much of it. But human wants? Infinite. We always want more. And that gap between limited resources and unlimited wants is called scarcity. And scarcity is the starting point of all economics. Every economic question at its core is about how to deal with scarcity. Economics is split into two big branches. Microeconomics, the small picture. How do individuals and businesses make decisions? How is the price of a single product decided? How does one market work? Think of it as zooming in. And then there's macroeconomics, the big picture. How does an entire country's economy function? What causes unemployment? What is inflation? How do countries grow? Think of it as zooming out. We're going to cover both today, starting from the very basics and building up. Part 2. Supply and demand, the foundation. If there's one concept that explains more about the world than anything else, it's supply and demand. This is the engine of every market economy. So let's start with the demand. Demand is simple. It's how much of something people want to buy at different prices. And there's one rule that almost never breaks. When the price goes up, people buy less. When the price goes down, people buy more. Makes sense, right? If your favorite coffee goes from $5 to $10, you might start making it at home. That's demand in action. Now let's go to supply. Supply is how much of something sellers are willing to produce and sell at different prices. And the rule here is opposite. When prices go up, sellers want to produce more because they are making more profit. But when the prices fall, it's less worth to produce. Now here's the magic. Supply and demand meet in the middle. Imagine a market for mangoes. If there are too many mangoes and not enough buyers, sellers drop the price to clear their stock. But if there's a drought and mango supply collapses and everyone still wants mangoes, prices shoot up. The price where supply exactly equals demand, where the market clears perfectly, is called the equilibrium price. And markets are always moving towards this point. This is why the eggs got expensive in 2022. Bird flu wiped out millions of chickens across the US. So the supply collapsed, but demand stayed the same. And the prices exploded. Well, that's supply and demand. This is also why concert tickets for popular artists sell out and then get resold for 10 times the price. More demand than supply. Same principle. Once you understand this, you'll start seeing it everywhere. Part 3. Elasticity. How sensitive are we to prices? Now here's a wrinkle. Not all products respond to price changes the same way. When the price of, say, luxury handbags doubles, a lot of people just stop buying them. Demand drops sharply. Economists say that the demand for these products is elastic. It stretches a lot when prices changes. But what about the insulin for a diabetic? Or petrol for your car? Or cigarettes for a smoker? Even if the prices go up, people will still buy roughly the same amount because they need it, or they are addicted, or there's no easy substitution. Well, that's inelastic demand. Demand that barely budges even when the price changes. So why does this matter in real life? Governments use this all the time. If you want to tax something to raise money without people just stopping to buy it, tax something inelastic like petrol, alcohol, tobacco. People will grumble, but they'll keep buying, and the government keeps collecting. But on the flip side, if a business sells something elastic, it has to be very careful about raising prices because consumers will disappear fast. Part 5: How prices are set, competition, and markets. So, who actually decides prices? In a free market, ideally nobody. Prices emerge naturally from competition. When there are many sellers competing for your money, they have to keep prices low and quality high. Otherwise, you just go to the next seller. This is perfect competition, great for consumers. But what happens when one company dominates an entire market? Well, that's called a monopoly. And monopolies are dangerous because when there's no competition, a company can charge whatever it wants, make worse products, and you'll still have no choice. Think of utilities in many cities like electricity, water, often run by a single provider. You can't exactly switch to a different electric company. So governments usually regulate this to protect consumers. And in between, you have oligopolies, a few big players controlling a market. Think airlines, smartphone makers, and telecom companies. They don't need to price fix illegally. They just kind of watch each other and keep prices similar, still less competitive than it should be for consumers. And that's why antitrust laws exist to prevent companies from getting so big that the competition dies entirely. When regulators go after Google or Meta for being monopolies, this is the principle behind it. Alright, we're zooming out now, from individual markets to the whole economy. Part 5: GDP. How do we even measure how big or healthy an economy is? The most important number is GDP, Gross Domestic Product. It is the total value of everything a country produces, goods and services, in a year. Think of it like a country's annual report card. A rising GDP means the economy is growing, people are getting jobs, and businesses are doing well. But a falling GDP, 2 quarters in a row, and that's officially called a recession. But GDP isn't perfect. Here's the thing: GDP measures quantity of economic activity, not quality of life. A country could have high GDP while most of that wealth is concentrated among a small elite and millions live in poverty. That's why economists also look at GDP per capita, GDP divided by population, to get a better sense of average living standards. Still, GDP is most widely used measure we have. When you hear the economy grew 7% this year, that's GDP growth they're talking about. Part 6: Inflation. Why does everything keeps getting more expensive? Now, let's talk about something everyone has felt, but maybe never fully understood: inflation. Inflation is when the general price level of things rises over time. When your grocery bill is higher this year than last year, even though you're buying the same stuff. That's inflation eating at your money. So, why does this happen? A few reasons. The most common: too much money chasing too few goods. If the government pumps a lot of money into the economy through spending or printing, but the amount of goods and services doesn't grow at the same rate, prices rise because there are more money competing for the same stuff. Then there is also cost push inflation. When the cost of producing things goes up, like when oil prices spike, everything that depends on transport gets expensive. That's why global oil prices affect the price of vegetables in your local market. A small amount of inflation, around 2% annually, is actually considered healthy. It encourages people to spend and invest rather than just hoard cash. But when inflation runs too high, it destroys purchasing power. Your savings lose value, and people on fixed incomes get crushed. The extreme version, hyperinflation, is devastating. In Zimbabwe in 2000s, inflation hit 89.76 trillion percent. People were carrying wheelbarrows of cash just to buy bread. Germany experienced it in 1920s, and Venezuela more recently. The opposite, deflation, where prices fall, sounds nice, but it's actually dangerous too. If people expect prices to keep falling, They stop spending now and wait. And when nobody spends, the economy grinds to a halt. So, yes, economists actually want a little inflation, just not too much. Part 7, the role of the central bank, how government fights inflation. So, we talked so much about inflation, but who controls the inflation? Well, that's the job of the central bank. In the United States, it's the Federal Reserve or the Fed. In Europe, it's the European Central Bank. In India, it's the Reserve Bank of India or the RBI. And their main weapon? It's interest rates. Here's how it works. When inflation is too high, the central bank raises interest rates. Higher interest rates means borrowing money becomes more expensive. Loans for homes, cars, businesses all get pricier. So people and companies borrow less, spend less, and the economy cools down. Thus, less spending equals to less demand equals to price stabilization. When the economy is sluggish or in recession, they cut interest rates. Cheaper borrowing encourages people to spend and invest, which heats up the economy back up. This is literally why you hear news anchors getting excited about the Fed raised rates by 0.25%. Because that decision ripples through every loan, every mortgage, and every business investment in the entire economy. Central banks also control the money supply. How much money is in the circulation? Well, they are not printing money on a printer, but they do control the flow of money through the banking system. It's a constant balancing act. Well, too hot causes inflation. Too cold causes recession. The goal is a Goldilocks economy, which is just right. A healthy economy aims for around 4 to 5% unemployment. This is called the natural rate of unemployment. The dangerous kind is the cyclical unemployment, caused by a recession or when the whole economy slows down and companies across every industry starts cutting jobs. That's when the government steps in with the fiscal stimulus, spending money on projects, extending unemployment benefits to try to jumpstart demand and bring back those jobs. The 2008 financial crisis sent unemployment in the US above 10%. COVID-19 briefly pushed it to nearly 15%. Well, these aren't natural, these are crises. Part 9, Fiscal Policy, what governments do with the money. We've talked about what central banks do. That's called monetary policy. But governments themselves also have a powerful economic tool called the fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is basically how a government taxes and spends. When the economy is struggling, the government can increase spending, build roads, hire more public workers, and expand welfare to inject more money into the economy and create jobs. This is called an expansionary fiscal policy. Think of it as the government being the buyer of last resort. Or the government can cut taxes, leaving more money in people's pocket and hoping they'll spend it. When the economy is overheating, the government can do the opposite. Spend less, raise taxes to cool things down. Now here's the catch. Government often spend more than they collect in taxes. That gap is called the budget deficit. To cover it, they borrow by issuing bonds. And that debt accumulates into the national debt. Well, some debt is totally fine, even necessary during crisis. But if it spirals out of control, it can lead to a loss of confidence in the country, rising borrowing costs, and serious economic pain. Greece's debt crisis in 2010 is a cautionary tale. Part 10, International Trade and Globalization. It is said that no country is an island, economically speaking. Every country trades with others, and that trade shapes everything. The basic idea behind international trade is comparative advantage, a concept from the economist David Ricardo. It says countries should produce what they are relatively best at and trade for everything else. Even if one country could theoretically produce everything cheaper than another, it still makes sense to specialize. Because your time and resources are limited, you should focus on what you do most efficiently. And that is why Bangladesh dominates textile manufacturing, Saudi Arabia exports oil, and Germany exports precision machinery. Everyone is playing to their strength. Now let's talk about globalization. It is the increasing connection of world economies through trade, investment, and technology. This has lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty over the past few decades. More trade, more jobs, cheaper goods. Sounds good, right? But it also has some critics, and those are legitimate. When factories move to cheaper countries, workers in richer countries lose jobs. Local industries can get wiped out by cheaper imports, and global supply chains, as we learned from the COVID, are fragile. When one link breaks, the whole chain suffers. Since we're talking about globalization and international trade, we need to understand tariffs. These are the taxes on imported goods, and this is how governments try to protect local industries. But tariffs can also trigger trade wars, where countries retaliate against each other using trade and tariffs. The US China trade war is a recent, very real example. Part 11: Economic Systems. Capitalism, socialism, and the middle ground. Now, a quick big picture question. Who should control all of this? Well, capitalism says let the private markets handle it. People and businesses own property, compete freely, and prices are set by supply and demand. The argument: competition drives innovation, efficiency, and growth. Most wealthy nations are largely capitalist. Socialism says key industries and resources should be owned collectively by the government or the workers and managed for the public benefit, not the private profit. The argument being markets create enormous inequality and can't be trusted to deliver things like healthcare or housing fairly. In practice, almost no country is purely one or the other. Most are mixed economies. Capitalism as the base, with government stepping in to regulate, tax, redistribute, and provide public services like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. The debate isn't really capitalism versus socialism. It's about where to draw the line. How much should the markets be free? And how much should the government intervene? That's one of the central political debates of our time, and reasonable people disagree. Okay, now let's bring it all together. Economics starts with one truth. Resources are scarce and we have to make choices. Supply and demand shapes prices. Markets allocate resources imperfectly but powerfully. Inflation erodes money. Central banks try to keep things balanced with interest rates. Governments use spending and taxes to steer the economy. Countries trade to play their strengths, and every society chooses its own mix of free market and government involvement. Well, that's economics, not a textbook, a lens for understanding the reality. The price of your coffee, the job market when you graduate, whether your savings grow or shrink, interest rates on a loan you take, a government policy that affects your neighborhood. All of it runs on these principles. And now you know the basics of them. So, if this video helped you, please hit the like button. It genuinely helps us reach more people. If you want me to go deeper on any of this topic like behavioral economics, the stock market, how banks actually work, and what causes financial crisis, drop it in the comments. Subscribe so you're there when that drops. I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for watching. Bye.